Hello everybody, welcome back to the channel. Good to see you all here. I'm just about getting ready to go out on a road trip tonight. Now, the reason I'm going out first and foremost is to test out this baby. This is the new Nikon Z6 Mark III camera. And I've had this for a while now, and I've been doing a bit of testing, and the testing continues tonight. Now, one of the other things that's a bit of a bonus, I think, depending on what happens tonight, is that there's an aurora predicted. So I'm going to be doing a little bit of aurora chasing as well as testing out this camera. I've got my Z6 Mark II, a couple of those in the car as well. And so I can do some comparisons and just see what I think about this camera. So anyway, let's get on the road. I've got all my bits and pieces. I've got so much stuff I'm taking with me. It's usually overkill when I do these trips, but anyway, let's get on the road. Well guys, as you can see, I've made my way out to a very familiar location. Yeah, I know, look, I've been here a few times this year already, but these beautiful big silos in the background, I guess the reason I keep coming back here is because it's just somewhere that makes it easy to test out new gear. I don't have to work too hard on my foreground because the foreground is huge. And so what I'm doing here tonight, I'm shooting, and I've been here for a little while. I was talking to Tony, who's the caretaker of this place. He's got the farm across the road there just before. We had a good chat, but I was waiting for it to get dark anyway. It's a beautiful, clear night. There was a fair bit of cloud early, but not much to worry us now. I'm not seeing any aurora, even though my alarm is going off in my pocket every now and then, so I'll just have to keep an eye on that. Now, this time of year, we're in August, the Milky Way, the start of August, the Milky Way galactic core is very high, really high. So I bolted on this lens, which is the Nikon 14-24 f2.8. That's the first one that I've started using to try out. And look, on the back of the screen, the images here are looking fantastic. So I'm not going to have a whole lot of time just to talk to the camera just at the moment, because I've got to make hay while the sun shines. And, you know, I'm testing this, like I said earlier, I want to test this with the previous models, the Z6 Mark II, even the Nikon ZF, which I actually used here at this very location. So it's good to be able to have some comparison. So I'm going to walk around and see if I can get some more different compositions here tonight, because the fact that the core is up so high, I wanted to get underneath some of these silos and sort of point a bit more up in the air. So let's go. Oh man, it is so good to get back to the car. I've been running around this silo complex. I've taken so many images. I'm sorry I haven't been able to speak to you guys. I've just been so busy. I haven't seen any aurora. Apparently there's something going on, but well, it's not going on here. So anyway, look, I've been busy enough. I don't need any other distractions. But so anyway, how am I going with this camera? Well, this is the Nikon Z6 Mark III. And look, it is pretty good. And I have to say, look, I've taken quite a few images with it here tonight, but I've also taken some images and some time-lapse footage on other nights. So I'm going to show you a little bit in more detail on the computer, but I want to give you just a basic assessment of what I think about this camera. It's slightly heavier and a bit wider than the Z6 Mark II, but it's got a really nice deep grip, which, as you know, I like a camera that has a deep grip. Now, this is pretty much the same as the Z6 Mark II, except it has a few features. Firstly, it's got a flip out screen. Now, you guys already know that. You would have seen that on all the brochures. You don't have to have a flip out screen for photography. It's ideal for video production, especially if you're going to be shooting facing the camera. And I've done a little bit of testing with this camera in video mode, and the video modes are very, very good. But that's not why I would buy this camera. One thing I did notice, now you'll notice I've got a remote control here sticking out the side. Now with the flip screen, you have a bit of trouble sometimes with those. Now, not so much the actual remote control, but when I had a battery pack attached to this, that's at the top socket, and I had I couldn't swivel the screen at all. So if I had that socket in or a HDMI, which I probably wouldn't, but if I did do video and I had a cable in there, you can't swivel the screen up and down, which is really a pain if you want to have up on a high tripod or something like that. Now, of course, the swivel screen, the flip screen is fantastic if you're in an orientation like this, where you want to get down in portrait mode, and I did that just here tonight. I found this awesome puddle down there, and I was getting a reflection of the silos, which was absolutely amazing. And of course, I used the flip screen. I had the camera almost touching the grass on the ground. So perfect example of where that comes in really handy. Now it has the feature that I mentioned when I did the Nikon ZF review a few months ago. It's got the starlight mode, which is the same as the Sony bright monitoring. Essentially what that does, you press a button and you can see the landscape, you know, I guess a high ISO or a low frame rate or something. It just sees in the dark. Very handy for composing your shot for Nightscape photography. So that works well, same as the ZF, same as the Z8, same as the Z9. So they've caught up with that. A lot of people have talked about this new camera, because it's got a different sensor, then they're worried about the dynamic range being decreased compared to the Z6 Mark II. So I can't really comment on that right now, because on the back of the camera you can't tell these things. But I will be having a good look on the computer, and we'll do a bit of an assessment of that later on. Speaking of comparing to the Z6 Mark II, now I did a time lapse, and the time lapse works exactly the same as the Z6 Mark II, which is fantastic, because that's one of the features that I think sets that camera apart. It is absolutely awesome. Day to night time lapses work a breeze, and it's the same with this. So that's really, really good. Apart from all of those things, the button layout's pretty much identical. The play button's down on the bottom corner here, which is the same as the Z8, Z9 cameras. So I suppose they wanted to standardize that. That doesn't really bother me either way. It's got a little bit different LCD screen on the top, but it still has the LCD screen. And I like having that because, for example, if you're doing a time lapse or star trails or something like that, where you're taking a whole heap of pictures and you've got the rear screen closed, just to save battery power, then it's good to be able to see that. Now this camera, slightly different to the Z6 Mark II, it has a little button on the top there which illuminates that screen, but only a really dull illumination, so it doesn't wreck any foregrounds or anything like that. So that's pretty good. Now, one thing I will say though, speaking of operating this via USB power delivery, I found that this camera, and the ZF was exactly the same as this, it's very fussy with power banks. So for example, I've got a whole stack of them here. Oh, they're in my case here. I'll show you in better light, but and only a few of them work, and it will not work with the USB-A cable on one end to USB-C on the other. So this is a USB port on the camera. Now with my Z6 Mark II cameras, they do work with the USB-A cable on one end, USB-C on the other, and I haven't yet found a power bank pretty much that doesn't power the Z6 II. But on these and the ZF and probably the Z8, I haven't tried a Z8, you have to have specific power banks. So that's one thing that I think, I don't know why. I don't know why they would change that. I really don't. It's just something to be aware of, because well, the same thing happened to me last time. I plugged the power bank in thinking, well, it always works in the past. Didn't work. Battery got right to the end, but I did manage to get right to the end of my time lapse. But the handling of the camera is fantastic. It feels good in the hand, works great on the tripod. The remote port, it has a remote port, works with all my old stuff, triggers. I did some flash photography. It's great for autofocus and all that sort of thing, which has no relevance at all to Nightscape photography, but it does it really well. I did some party shots at a 60th birthday party the other day, and it worked really, really well. So anyway, look, I'm going to continue on here. I'm going to do a panorama down there of the silo with a setting Milky Way galactic core over the top, but I've got to wait a little bit for the core to get down. But nevertheless, I'm still going. I'm shooting all sorts of things around here. It's a fantastic place for shooting Nightscape images. So what I think we'll do, we'll leave the video here. We'll go back home. I'll show you some pictures on the computer. I'll show you some final images, and then we'll do a bit of a wrap up about the comparison between this, the Z6 II, Z6 III, and tell you what I think about this camera and whether you should buy one. And so we find ourselves here in Lightroom on the computer, and I want to show you some examples of the images I took last night out at the silo. So here's the first one. Now, there's no extra light on this except for a car that was driving into the driveway at the time. You can see it's quite dark here in the foreground. This was shot on a Nikon 14-24 f2.8 at about 14 millimeters, 15-second shutter speed at ISO 4000. So what I'm going to do is attempt to have a look and just see what the dynamic range is on this camera for Nightscape photography, because ultimately that's one of the things that people have been criticizing the Nikon Z6 Mark III about. So let's just raise up the shadows here and see what happens. So you can see there's a bit of detail in here. It's still underexposed in that foreground a bit. Let's zoom in. You can see it looks noisy, obviously. It's ISO 4000. It doesn't look too bad. That's just with a bit of shadow detail recovery. Let's just put a little bit of Lightroom noise reduction in there, and that's a lot better, as you can see. Now, noise reduction always softens an image, but it's not too bad. Now, one of the things about noise reduction, you will see here in the areas where the silo is lit better, in the background here, it looks far better than these really blotchy dark areas. That's typical with any camera and any situation. So one of the things to do if you want a cleaner image regarding noise is put some light on your subject. But anyway, let's just go back, and I'm just going to increase the exposure here a little bit just to see what that looks like. And you can see that image doesn't look too bad. I've done virtually, well, no editing at all except increase the exposure and add just a touch of noise reduction. That's pretty good. Okay, let's move on. I want to show you some other ones. Now, this is one that I've done an edit on only in Lightroom. I've done nothing else anywhere else. You can see what I've done. I've added some exposure, a bit of highlights, shadows, a bit of dehaze, and of course there'll be some noise reduction. Yeah, luminance plus 30, etc. So let's compare that to how we started off. So you can see this is the original straight out of camera. I did apply a little bit of light painting on this, and you can see there with my adjustments, this is what it looks like. Pretty good. Again, this is the 14-24 f2.8 lens. So that's, you can see there with the noise reduction, that looks okay. Let's just hop out of there and I'll give you a full screen preview of that image. That's not bad. I'm pretty happy with that. If I was working with this image, I'd think that was okay. Another one. Now this again is edited with pretty much exactly the same edits I did on that previous one. Single exposure, nothing else done to it except a bit of noise reduction, a bit of dehaze you can see there. Now if I again show you the before and after, there it is. Now it's light painted. As you can see here, the light painting doesn't show up anywhere near as much, but when I do the adjustments, the light painting really does come to the fore. So let's just have a look at that again. Full screen. That's not bad. Milky Way above the back of the silos there. So I did a lot of images while I was out there, and at the end of this video, or towards the end, I'm going to show you all of the images finally edited. But I want to show you this one here before we move on. Now, I found this gorgeous puddle. As you can see here, this is a single shot, again at 14mm, f2.8, 20-second shutter speed at ISO 4000. Done a little bit of adjustment here, and I wanted to do a focus stack to include this foreground here. So I left the camera in exactly the same place, and instead of that I did this shot here. Now this is lit in the foreground, but it's focus stacked to this closer foreground. You can see the foreground here near the camera is actually in focus. So it's not quite at infinity because it was very, very close to the camera, as you can see. And the background will be out of focus. Yeah, as you can see, the stars are not round, they're bloated. So I was just doing a simple focus stack. Now, this one I shot at f4. Why did I do that? Just to give it a little bit more depth of field, to get more in focus. I didn't need to capture all the background in that particular shot. So when I blended those two together, we ended up with this image here, which I think is outstanding. I love this shot. That's just two images, 14mm, focus stacked, Nikon Z6 Mark III. I'm delighted with this shot. It is very sharp, very clear. And as you can see, I've done some light painting on the background. Silos, not much else. The only reason I took it to Photoshop was to do the actual blending of the foreground and background. I haven't done any fancy stuff on this at all. So I'm very, very happy with that. So if you zoom in on these silos, you can see there's quite a bit of detail. Noise reduction has been added, of course, but I'm very happy with it. Very happy indeed. Really, really nice. Look at that reflection. Gorgeous. So there you go. This is the Z6 Mark III. I'm going to show you some other images later. I'll just show you this one that I took. Foreground is standing back a little bit, and this is a panorama foreground of only a few images joined. I just wanted to get a little bit more width, but the sky is a single framing of 20mm focal length tracked, and this is the tracked and stacked sky. So there's 10 images I shot on the star tracker and blended them in with this foreground image moving a little bit closer. I've got another wider angle which I'll show you later on. Once again, love this shot. I think it's got a lot of dynamics. It's sharp and clean, and you can see when you zoom in, good, sharp definition. I did apply noise reduction. Of course, you have to apply noise reduction to all of these images because otherwise, well, you'll end up with a bit of a mess. But anyway, I'll show you more detail on that later. But before I do that, I do want to show you some comparisons with the Z6 Mark II camera. All right, so this is the same location, but about a year earlier, I was out there shooting with my Z6 Mark II camera. You can see there's an aurora happening. And so this image here is shot with a 20mm focal length. So it's a little bit different focal length, slightly different settings as well. This is 20-second shutter speed at ISO 4000. So it's somewhere near the other one, but the other one was a 14mm lens. So a little bit different from that regard. But if I add some shadow detail to this one, you can see there's a lot of detail comes out when I add the shadows in. Also a lot more when if I wanted to increase the exposure, which in this image probably doesn't need it. Let's zoom in a little bit and have a look at this one. So obviously there is a bit of noise because, like I said before, this image is lit a little bit better than the other one. Now I think that's because it was a different time of night, and I think there was a little bit more ambient light, which helps, obviously, like I said before. If I just go down to the bottom, I don't think... No, there's no noise reduction on this at all. So let's just add a bit. So that's a very clean image. Very clean indeed. I would say probably a little bit better than the other one. But let's just check out some other images. Let's have a look at this one here, because I want to try and compare apples with apples here. So this image has no edits at all. Let's just increase the shadow detail once again. That's not bad. Remember, this is a Z6 Mark II, so I'm trying to get a bit of a comparison going here. There is some ambient light there, which does help on those silos. Noisy. like I said before, but let's just add a little bit of noise reduction into this. Luminance plus 28. Looks a lot better, doesn't it? And of course, you could do a lot more adjustments. I've done virtually nothing to this. There's a lot of detail. So if I increase the exposure by just over 1 stop there, it's pretty good recovery. Pretty good. And if you were working on this image, you could do a lot more than that. Let's just copy that onto one of these other images. So this is quite a dark foreground. So the people who were talking about the dynamic range issue on the Nikon Z6iii were talking about underexposing and then pushing the exposure later in post. Now, you do that a lot when you're shooting nightscape photography, but never ever would you go 4 and 5 stops above whatever's captured in camera. That's just ridiculous. This image here is plus 1 stop and 100% shadows. So if I take the shadows down, you can see what's happening. But there's a fair bit of detail showing there, and I don't mind it. That's only with very marginal noise reduction added in. So this, remember, is a Z6 Mark II, a previous model of camera, which I've always been really happy with regarding image quality. So let's just have a look at a couple more. I don't want to labour the fact too much, but let's have a look at this image here. So once again, this is 20mm focal length, 20-second shutter speed, f2.8 at ISO 3200, a RAW in the background, but virtually no detail in this foreground at all. It's just a black blob. Let's increase the shadows 100%, and there's a lot of detail comes out. Quite a lot. Noisy, yes, but detail. Even in the trunk of that tree, you can see quite a bit of detail. So this is the Z6 Mark II. Now, I didn't shoot the tree with my Z6 Mark III, so I can't compare the exact same image, different night, different conditions, no aurora on this more recent trip. But you can see the Z6 Mark II does have excellent shadow recovery. And I think if I had to choose, I would say probably the Mark II version is a little bit better. They have different sensors totally. But I think the Z6 Mark II shadow recovery is probably slightly better, but there's not a lot in it. All right, so let's just quickly go back to a Z6 Mark III. This is an image I took the other night, totally underexposed, as you can tell there. It's a 15-second shutter speed, 20mm focal length at f2.2, ISO 2500. So let's just see what we can get out of this one. Increase the shadows by 100%. Zoom in. Yeah, there's a fair bit of detail. Lots of noise in this image. You always get noisy images when they're underexposed like this. Add a bit of exposure. And yeah, it's got a lot of recovery. It's just a matter of trying to get detail in that foreground. Now, typically, I wouldn't shoot an image in this way and just bring the shadows up at night. I would add some light, or perhaps I would shoot for a longer period of time. So what else have I got here? This one does have a little bit of light painting on it. And you can see there, just a little bit around the edges. Increase the shadow detail. So yeah, there's a lot more detail in this shot simply because I added light. So when I'm shooting my nightscape photography, if I can't add light, then I add exposure time because that gathers ambient light. So you can see this is, remember, the Z6 Mark III camera with an originally totally underexposed image, as you can see on the left, but with touch of light painting, and that really helps a lot. So we can push this image a lot more if we wanted to get a lot more detail out of it, and then add some noise reduction, and away you go. So I don't really think there's a problem with this camera for shooting nightscape photography. So I'm not going to be increasing my images by 4 stops in post. I'm going to be adding light painting, or I'm going to be adding ambient light by using a longer shutter speed exposure. Just one more example I want to show you from the Z6 Mark III. Now this was not meant to be capturing the foreground, but I'm going to show you what it looks like. This is 20mm focal length, f2.2, 15-second shutter speed at ISO 3200, no edits, adjustments at all. This one, I'm just going to push the shadows to 100, and you can see we are seeing now some foreground detail. As you'd imagine, it's noisy, but it's quite there, it's detailed. Now let's have a look at bit more exposure, and that's going up just under 1 stop. So lots of detail. You can see what's down here in the background. So this was a shoot I did a while back. You can see the old Morris 1100 sitting up on the rock there. You can see the wind towers in the background down here on the mountain, aeroplane going through. Quite a lot of noise, which is exactly what you'd expect. But there is detail in this tree. Have a look at that. You can see colour. No noise reduction on this, remember. Now, I'm not going to be shooting that tree in this way. The way I did it was to shoot the sky. I stacked the sky, as you can see here. There's quite a few exposures. Then I shot some foreground shots with light painting, just like this. I've showed you my methods before, and blended all of those together, and I've ended up with this image, which I think looks pretty good, full screen. That's how I like my foregrounds. Get brilliant detail, no issue with dynamic range because it's correctly exposed. One more shot with the Nikon Z6 Mark III, and you can see here a completely black silhouette foreground. Now this is obviously underexposed for the foreground, but if I just increase the shadows to 100%, you can start to see quite a bit of detail, and I'll increase the exposure a little bit as well. And suddenly, that's very, very clear. That's 1 stop. It's noisy, but it shows quite a bit of detail in those rocks, quite a bit of texture, and I think with a bit of massaging you'd get something out of that. Now, I'm not going to shoot like that because, as I mentioned, it's totally underexposed, and I don't shoot my nightscapes that way. If I want to shoot this foreground without adding light, I will simply increase the shutter speed and gather more light, and then you are increasing your dynamic range by default. So I took a number of images, as you can see here, and for this one I used a star tracker for the background. I'll show you that in a minute, but here's a foreground image shot at a lower ISO. Really good detail, beautiful detail. That one's shot at f5.6, 10 seconds, ISO 800. So at the lower ISO, less noise issues to worry about. Final shot looks like this, and this is a beauty. Love this one. So I think you can see from those example images and videos that this camera is very, very capable for shooting excellent Milky Way and Nightscape photography images. And you know, I guess the differences between this and the previous model, I've talked about a fair bit. So I'll just very briefly run down what I think about this camera. It's slightly larger than the previous Z6 Mark I and Mark II, but really it doesn't bother me. The grip is excellent. Ergonomics, fantastic. It's got all the in and out ports that you would ever need for shooting. It's got the remote, it's got everything else. The other thing, the big thing that's changed between this and the previous model is this flip screen. I talked about it in the video and demonstrated the pluses and the minuses. For core photographers, most of them don't like flip screens. They prefer a tilt screen. But in certain circumstances, it is really handy to be able to get down low in that portrait orientation. So I'm happy to live with the trade-off with that. By the way, the screen is excellent. Also, the EVF is absolutely fantastic in this camera. It is an improvement over the previous model. I mentioned also the starlight mode, which is really, really good for Milky Way photography. Helps the composition in a dark environment without having to turn a heap of lights on. It is really excellent. And one of the major features why you might want to use this camera. Now, I talked about power bank options. Now, let me just show you something. I've got all of these which do not work with this camera. And I've got just two that actually do work with this camera. Now, on my previous model, a Z6 Mark II, all of those worked. Not only that, I've got all of these USB cables that do not work with this camera. Why is that? I don't know. It still has the USB power option, but for some reason, it's very fussy about the cable management of such things. I don't know why that is. But apart from that, once you work that out and you work out which power banks to take with you, which cables to have, it's a no-brainer. It still works beautifully. You saw the time lapses and they were straight out of camera. This thing does excellent time-lapse work. Now, what about the big thing that I haven't spoken about at all, the price? This thing is worth an absolute fortune at the moment. So it's about 4,400 Australian dollars. That is very expensive. And you know, the Z6 Mark II would be probably, well, you can get one for probably half of that price. And is it twice as good a camera? Certainly not. The Z6 Mark II is still probably my favorite camera because it is just great to use. It's a little bit smaller, lighter, fantastic on a star tracker. By the way, this is good on a star tracker as well. So that little bit extra weight doesn't really make that much difference, but double the price does. And I paid good money for this. And I think look, it's going to last me a long time. For general photography, this is the better camera because it has a more wide-ranging feature set, especially for daytime photography, for portrait photography, for wildlife photography. The autofocus is better, no doubt about that. But the Z6 Mark II is still an excellent camera in my opinion. So anyway, there you have it. This is my look. You would have noticed there wasn't one mention of charts or formulas or graphs or any of that sort of stuff. I much prefer to look at the real world examples of how I would use this camera and what I would do with it, and you've seen the images. So sure, there's plenty of videos out there talking about comparing low light charts and graphs and signal to noises and high ISO performance. I just use my eyes. I look at the results and I judge it from there. So anyway, I hope you've enjoyed this video. Thanks so much for tuning in and look forward to seeing you in the next one. Have a great week.